back to Abraham. And so we're here in Genesis chapter 12. And the question was, can you be saved if you abandoned your father's religion and came out from under his authority under the system of household salvation? And the answer to that is yes, absolutely. But there are certain prerequisites, and that is that the father himself is either an idolater or has corrupted the true religion of God. Now, the prime example of both of these, where you can't leave your father's religion under penalty of death or punishment or ostracism, or where you can leave your father's religion because God has revealed another way. This prime example is Abraham. So let's just take a look at this in verse number 1 of Genesis chapter 2. The Lord said to Abram, "Get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house." This is Genesis 12:1. Okay, is a problem? Okay, want to make sure everybody, excuse the phrase, is on the same page. So here is Abraham's father. Terah, I believe, was his name. And God said to Abraham, and here he is, "Get thee out of your father's jurisdiction. Come out from under his roof." Now, I believe that Terah was a fine man, but he was, if you remember, this was the Babylonian era where you had the Tower of Babel, the kingdom of Nimrod, the one world religion, and the like, and they were all affected by it. Except God knew Abraham's heart and appeared to him and said, "Look, if you want me to be on your side, leave your father's house." Now that was an abandonment of Terah's authority, his religion, and his God by Abraham. So in this case, it sets a precedent. Can a person abandon household salvation? And the answer is yes, if the father is an idolater or if the father has corrupted the true religion. And so what is going to happen is over here, Abraham is going to start the true religion with God and household salvation. So let's go to Genesis 17. And it says here in verse number 1, Abraham was 90 years old and 9. The Lord appeared to him and said, "I am Almighty God, walk before me and be thou perfect." Now, right here gives us a stipulation regarding the father. Any father who is going to have household salvation must himself be in good standing and in good stead with God. Now, so the first thing that God tells Abraham, all right, I'm going to give you household salvation here, but here's the stipulation. Your father wasn't what he should be, and I told you to leave him. But I'm going to have your kids to follow you. You be perfect. You be what you should be before me. Now, that lets us know that not every father is in this area. Now, I'm sure that heathen fathers, pagan fathers, idolatrous fathers were good fathers in the sense that maybe they cared for their families and they loved them and tried to do right, generally speaking, by them. But when they enter the realm of religion, enter the realm of spiritual things, they were God haters, and therefore somebody like Abraham, who was the friend of God, a lover of God, had to leave the authority of his father's house. Didn't mean that there was not natural affection for his father. It just simply meant that his destiny was God. And in order to do that, he had to leave his father's religion. Now, as we're starting this, we're going to go through Israel's history and come to the tribulation period, where fathers are going to take the mark of the beast. And sons are going to say, okay, now I've got a choice here. I can either join my father's religion and take that mark, or I can reject the religion of my father and his false god in favor of becoming part of the remnant and the true God. So in that case, there was no household salvation. They, like Abraham, must leave that. But if you're going to have household salvation, verse number 1 again, I'm Almighty God, walk before me, Abraham. You've got a lifetime now. As you have time in your life, well, he's 99 years old, but we're going to establish this. I want you to walk before me and be perfect. In that case, I will make my covenant between me and you. So, with regard to household salvation, and we'll just draw our little house here, we're going to put God up here. We're going to put A for Abraham here, and God's going to establish his house. Now, it's going to be another interesting thing here with regard to salvation. When God establishes his covenant with Abraham, you can't get salvation outside of his house. You know, this more or less fits in with our study of, well, should we go to other churches? I just ask you the question. Under the Abrahamic covenant, could you go to another church with another God? No, you could not. Did Abraham know enough to teach his family with regard to peripheral deities? You know, yes, he did. He knew what was right. That was be thou perfect meant you have a perfect understanding, a comprehension of what is required of you, and you teach them correctly. And we'll see that. There is a tremendous responsibility under household salvation to get your kids right before God, because you are going to pass on a heritage to them regarding one God and one God only. That's what the covenant's about. So let's read on. Verse number 4. As for me, behold, my covenant is with you, Abraham. Drop down to verse 6. I'll make thee exceeding fruitful, etc. Now verse 7. I will establish my covenant between me and thee. Now one more time, God says, all right, look, we are going to have us here a covenant. And this covenant is going to unite us in a bond that for the most part, there are some contingencies, but for the most part, an indissoluble bond, an everlasting bond. And I'm going to keep my part of the bargain. You're going to have to keep your part of the bargain. But I want you to see something else with regard to this, as it has to do with household salvation. There was no salvation apart from Abraham and his house. There was no salvation apart from Abraham and his covenant. There was no salvation because the one and only true God established this way of approach through Abraham. Now, we getting the picture here with regard to dispensational truth and Paul. There is no salvation apart from Paul's gospel. There is no salvation apart from what God told him. There is no salvation apart from what God established in this man for this age. And so when we start to saying, well, we'll look out this direction for salvation, we'll look out this direction for salvation, you can't find it there. It's we can quote the verse of Scripture appropriately. Neither is there salvation in any other. There's none other name given among men whereby they must be saved. In this case, before Jesus Christ came, it was the name of Abraham. You wanted to be saved, you had to believe in the God of Abraham and approach him Abraham's way. Now, it's the very same thing in this dispensation. That when we argue about the validity of other churches, all we have to ask is, what is their man? Who did God establish his gospel with for this time in history? And if it's someone other than Paul, they don't get salvation, just like no one else got salvation if they chose any other way but Abraham's way. But now, you'll remember back at this time, God gave up the Gentiles anyway. That was the importance of Abraham leaving Terah, his father. God's going to do something new. And here's what he's doing. I'm going to establish this covenant between me and thee, and thy seed after thee, in their generations. So here's household salvation. And we'll just simply draw it this way with a line going to through history. Here is history down here, and history is beginning to tick off from this point forward. It's your seed. Therefore, they have to come from the loins of Abraham. And that seed must be associated with the covenant, as we'll see here in just a little bit. And that particular covenant goes through the seed through their generations. Now, how long, therefore, when God is establishing this covenant, how long is this covenant to be in effect? Forever. It's an everlasting covenant. So it means that even though Abraham is going to die, the Abrahamic covenant is binding upon his family and upon all who join themselves with him for a relationship with this God forever. You don't get salvation apart from the Abrahamic covenant and the things that this covenant requires. So when you're talking about household salvation, it is very, very strict. So we come back here and it says, verse number 7, I'm going to make it between me and you and your seed in their generations for an everlasting covenant. Now, here's the stipulation. I'll be God, and you'll be my people. And here is the covenant. So therefore, everything revolves around this covenant as it comes from the house of Abraham. So much so that no one else could be saved. No one else could get salvation unless they were related to Abraham, because he was the only one God dealt with regarding the doling out, the dispensing of salvation. And only those were God's people. He would only be the God of the people that related themselves to him through Abraham in his covenant. And people who are covenanters today and reformers today, they haven't a clue as what the Abrahamic covenant really is all about. There is no such thing as another religion. There is no such thing as another God. There's no such thing as another way. Abraham has the monopoly on all of it. If you don't get salvation through him, you don't get salvation regardless of your God, religion, sincerity, on and on. It must come through him. That is the stringent requirements. Those are the stringent requirements of the Abrahamic covenant. So let's go back. And if you do this, I'll be a God to you and to your seed after you. It's an everlasting covenant because I'm going to give you the land, verse 8, for an everlasting possession. And in this land, I will be their God. So, the God of the universe, and I like this about God. Not only is he generous, not only is he gracious, not only is he merciful and the like, but he also simplifies things so that it eliminates confusion. And people who do not see this as you go through history, that God is not going to try to make it so complex that we can't get it. And we got to admit, he's smarter than we are. So he says in verse number 9, you've got to keep my covenant, therefore, plus your seed after you in their generations. Why do you think when the guys arrived on the scene in Jesus' time to Israel, what were they doing? They were calling Israel back to the covenant requirements of God through their father Abraham. Not only that, their father Isaac, as we'll see in a moment, their father Jacob, so that Israel was called the house of Israel and the children of Israel. The whole nation was. Well, who was Israel? One of their fathers. salvation was given to him and his seed after him through the generations, and those were some of the first fathers, the patriarchal fathers. So let's read on. This is my covenant, which ye shall keep between me and you and your seed after you. Every man child among you shall be circumcised. All right, now here's what we're going to do. The first thing that we're going to see is that in times before Abraham, you had fathers like Job. Job was not a circumcised believer, but Job had a relationship with the true and living God, and Job was the priest of his family. Job offered sacrifices for his reprobate sons and daughters who like to party all the time, and he was a priest. However, when you get to Abraham, you have an added dimension to his priesthood. This is called a patriarchal priesthood, where the father, it wasn't like the high priest and the priest of Israel, and it wasn't like the pastor teacher of today, or the family situations of today. Abraham became their priest, but he became the priest under a covenant situation. Therefore, if Job came under this, Job might as well forget offering sacrifices for his sons and his daughters if they didn't get what? The sons especially. Circumcised. The added dimension of the covenant regarding the priesthood. Now here's God up here, and Abraham represented his house before the true and living God. But the only way he could do that was by taking the token of the covenant. So Abraham was the priest of the covenant. He led his family to the true and living God because he was the one that God made the covenant with. Everybody succeeding in line had to look back to what God did to this man, their father, their first father, to whom God gave this covenant, if they wanted to approach God. That's what the Abrahamic covenant's all about. But now, if you're talking about household salvation, you're talking about something else. Abraham, we'll draw it over here, became the promoter of the covenant. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let's read and then we'll comment. This is my covenant between me and you and your seed. Every man child shall be circumcised, and ye shall circumcise the flesh of your foreskin. It'll be a token of the covenant betwixt me and you. He that is 8 days old shall be circumcised among you, every man child in your generations that is born in your house, bought with money. In other words, if there's a Gentile and he wants to stay with you, he too has to be circumcised, which is not of your seed, is born in your house, bought with your money, must needs be circumcised, and my covenant shall be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. So come down here to verse number 23. So it says, Abraham took Ishmael his son, all that were born in his house, all that were bought with his money, every male among them in Abraham's house. And the word house keeps appearing because it's household salvation. And he's telling these guys, you want to stay with me and have a relationship with my God? This is what you got to do. But now, interesting thing is, Abraham not only is the priest of this covenant and this God, he's the promoter of the covenant. Guess who's going to do the circumcising? Abraham is. No one else is raised. He's going to do it. And so that's what it's saying here. And he circumcised the flesh of their foreskin in the selfsame day as God said unto him. He circumcised the flesh of his own foreskin, and Ishmael, and verse 27, all the men of his house, born in his house, bought with money of the stranger, were circumcised with him. Now, that is, God meant business about this, but he not only was the priest, he was the promoter of the covenant. And that reminds me with regard to each father in succeeding generations. When they had a male child born, did the male child have anything to say about the circumcision in this father's house? No, why not? He's only 8 days old. he might have protested in other ways because of the pain, but he didn't know what was going on, that's for sure. The father was the promoter. I entered into this legal contract with God. God gave me a son, and my son's going to worship that same God, or he is going to be accountable to me as to why not. And so the father became the promoter. But now there's one more thing with regard to this. The father also became the protector of the covenant. Let's read verse number 14. The uncircumcised child, whose flesh of his foreskin is not circumcised. In other words, he does not have a covenant relationship with me through Abraham. That soul shall be cut off from his people, and he hath broken my covenant. This is verse 14 in Genesis 17. So, let me ask you this. Who was the guy who protected the covenant? Although Ishmael was circumcised, Ishmael rejected Isaac, in whose, this is what I'm going to do, says God. I'm going to continue the covenant on, and in Isaac shall your seed be called. And Ishmael mocked Isaac. And what did Abraham do to Ishmael? Cast out the bondwoman and her son. He was circumcised, but he still rejected Isaac. Or you could be uncircumcised and reject the covenant altogether and Abraham's God and God's system as established. Either way, the person in charge was the father or head of the house. That's household salvation. Now, if you'll come back with me to the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 13. Deuteronomy chapter 13. Now, the way that we know that there were two things with regard to this as a promoter, or excuse me, as a protector. One is over here, and I'll just put O for ostracize. I can spell it. I'm not going to take the time. The protector said, if God specifies a certain man in this covenant to believe in, through whom the covenant stipulations are dispensed, and you reject that man, you do not get covenant blessings even though you are circumcised. Now, does that bring to mind the times of Christ? Jesus Christ was the greater than Isaac. And here's Isaac back here, but as history went on, here was Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ came to the nation of Israel, who, like Ishmael, they were all circumcised. But what did they do that Ishmael did that made them forfeit their covenant blessings? They rejected Christ. Ishmael rejected Isaac. In Isaac thy seed will be called. Later on, it was in Jesus Christ shall your seed be called. Ishmael rejected Isaac, and out he went. He's not going to be part of the kingdom. He's not a saved man. Get out of my house, said Abraham. That's what it is. And then you come up to Jesus Christ. He came to circumcise men, and he said, believe on me. The Father has sent me and specified that through me, the covenant blessings will be dispersed to you guys. And they rejected him per se. And you know what God's going to do to those birds? Out you go. That's why it says the children of the kingdom are going to be cast into outer darkness. Why? They rejected the specified person of the covenant. And because of that, they're going to be ostracized, but because of that also, they're going to be executed. And I can spell that as well, but for time, we'll just put E. Who did the execution? The Father. Here is added the extrapolation of the Abrahamic covenant with regard to children under your roof was incorporated into the Mosaic law and elaborated upon so that you knew exactly what you were to do by any man who either rejected or was circumcised and rejected the covenant. You were executed. Talking to the man of the house. Verse 6, Deuteronomy 13. If your brother, the son of your mother, or your son, or your daughter, or your wife of your bosom, or your friend which is as thine own soul, entice thee secretly, saying, let us go and serve other gods, which you have not known, thou nor thy fathers. Now, mind you, please keep in mind, what is the first thing that Abraham or the father is to his family? A priest to a specific God. If you go after other gods, what have you done to the covenant? You've broken it. This covenant is so I will be a God to you and you will be my people. If you go after another God, I'm not going to be your God and you're not going to be my people, and there are repercussions to be said. One of the repercussions is going to come from Daddy himself, who should have raised you right. No other gods, no other gods, no other religion, no other church. There's one right church. You come here, I'm the ones representing God to you. I'm the patriarchal priest of this house, and we're in covenant relation with him, a legal binding a contract with God that I'm going to be saved, and part of that is part of my salvation is leading you in the right path. You know the verse in Proverbs, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old and not depart from it. You know something? That first had great significance to a Jewish father under law. And that's how Jesus was raised. And it was intensive training. So it says, note verse number 6 again, the last part of the verse. Let us go and serve other gods which thou hast not known, thou nor thy what? Fathers. What's that a reminder of? Household salvation passed to the seed of Abraham through the generations. Your fathers didn't know this God. You're trying to introduce a strange God. You're breaking the covenant. Namely the gods of the people which are round about you, far off on the earth. Now note what they're told. Note what the father is to do. Thou shalt not consent to him. Son, you big dummy. What is wrong with you? Have you not been in this house? Every 6 days we have a Sabbath. Look at the walls of this house, what we'll see. The doors, the gatepost. Every time we sit down, every time we stand up, every time we go to bed, every time we go to the field, what do we quote? The law. And one of the very first part of the law is no other gods before me, says Jehovah. And that's the God of this household. And you mean you haven't listened? You don't consent to him. Now, here's a case where if the father's right with God, he has authority to punish the son to the point of death for trying to break the covenant. Thou shalt not consent to him. Don't hearken to him. Don't pity him. But he's my son. That doesn't matter. He is a reprobate and he deserves execution as much as any other person in Israel that breaks this. Don't spare him. Don't conceal him. But thou shalt surely kill him. You, Dad, your hand shall be first upon him to put him to death, and afterwards the hand of all the people. You'll stone him with stones that he die, because he sought to thrust thee away from the Lord thy God, which brought thee out of Israel. And all Israel will hear, and shall do no more any such wickedness as this among you. So that is the way that it is now. Here is the father of the household, and here is the son, and that son approaches the true and living God through that father by way of a covenant relationship. And if the father is right with God, The son must legally, because that son was circumcised and made a child of the covenant, the father saw to it, 8 days old, that son is legally bound to worship that God under penalty of death if he doesn't. Who's to kill him? Daddy is. So if daddy is right with God, the son has no legal right to abandon his father's God, religion, authority, etc. But as we'll see, by the time we get to the tribulation period, who is the one who perhaps may corrupt his religion? Daddy, by taking the mark of the beast and saying to the son, well, you're living under my roof, you're going to take that mark too. And the son, fully aware of what that mark is, said, Dad, I love you, but you're going to have to catch me to kill me because I am fleeing this territory. I'm getting out from under your jurisdiction, and I'm going to establish my own house salvation with the true and living God by going back to the Abrahamic covenant. Any father who takes 666 has broken the Abrahamic covenant because he's worshiping Antichrist, which is the epitome, Antichrist in his image, which is the epitome of idolatry and male worship, man worship. All right, so let's go back here. Where am I? Let's go back to, what is my time? Genesis again. Genesis chapter 17. Numero uno, baby. He is the guy that started it all. Verse number 14 again, the uncircumcised man or the circumcised man that rejects God's appointed man, this is Genesis 17:14, gets cut off from his people. Being cut off means, number one, in the case of Ishmael, you can be ostracized, never to be allowed in. So therefore, you are alive, but you can never be what? You can't be saved. It's too late. God did this with another guy, by the way, who marked him and didn't let him come back into the presence of God, and that was Cain. Cain had a mark. He could not come back into the presence of God, and he went on his way. But what did that mean regarding him? Everything spooked him because the minute he died, he was going to plunge into hell. There was no redemption for Cain. He was marked to live this life, but never have the ability to get saved. Ishmael was marked. The covenant mark, the covenant token was on this man, but he rejected Isaac, and therefore he was alive, but he could never get saved. As soon as he died, he was plunged to hell with no hope at all. All right. And this is why it says, verse number 19, Sarah, your wife, is going to bear you a son, not Hagar the Egyptian, but Sarah, your half-sister, part of the family. There's keeping it all in the family. We've studied genetics and that before. Isaac, I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant and with his seed after him. Isaac is the guy. Verse 21 again, my covenant will I establish with Isaac. So the next guy here is Isaac. Now, Isaac, therefore, gives it to Jacob. Turn to Genesis 28. We'll read this verse, and then this is where we'll start the next time. These verses, Isaac, verse 1, Genesis 28, called Jacob, blessed him and charged him, saying, don't take a wife of the Canaanites. But God Almighty is going to bless you and make you fruitful, multiply you, and give to you the blessing of Abraham, to you and to thy seed with thee. And so as we go on in this chapter, we have the Jacob's ladder incident here. And that's why he says in verse 13, I'm the Lord God of Abraham, thy father, and the God of Isaac, your father. And the land that whereon you lie, I'll give it to you and your seed. I'll be with you, says verse 15 and of the like. So, as we saw, from father to father, even though Abraham died, the covenant was passed down to a father. And that covenant then was passed down to another father. And we'll see when we open up the next verses that the covenant is going to be passed down to 12 fathers and then on to the nation. And it's important to remember that when you're talking about the nation of Israel later on, that all of these conditions were in effect so that people could be saved if they were circumcised and believed in the right man, or they could be ostracized or executed if they did not.